Salutations, industrialists! I'm Mark, a producer working on Gilded Destiny. We're making good progress refining several of the important features of Gilded Destiny in preparation for the release of the alpha version of the game to our Kickstarter and Modian backers. For more information on our development schedule, check out our 10th alpha roadmap, linked in the description. In today's Dev Diary, we're going to talk a bit about how we're approaching historical events, both in terms of our overall design philosophy and in terms of how we model them using our game systems. We've covered this in more general terms in a previous Dev Diary, but this time we'll be dealing with some actual examples that have been designed and implemented. We'll also show how they're configured in the game editor and give some indication of how that works. So first off, our general approach to historical events is that we want the player to be able to play through them as they happened, if they so choose. Obviously, making a game with systems that cover all of the variety of history, from the micro to the macro, would be impossibly complex or practically unplayable, so sometimes we need to deal in abstractions or use workarounds to get the result we want. However, we also include options for the player to depart from history, since part of the fun of playing a historical game comes from having the freedom to change history. This can happen both in relation to the game's events, the direct choices a player makes when presented with an event or decision, and in relation to the game's systems. So the ways the overall geopolitics of the globe might change as a result of, well, playing the game. After all, just as there's no guarantee that country X or country Y will exist by the time we get to a certain date, there is no guarantee that they'll own a certain province, or have such and such a government, or be in such and such alliances. You get the picture. At the same time, we need some events to be broad enough that diverging from a highly specific set of historical circumstances doesn't mean that you'll end up with no events at all. And then on top of that, we want to cover at least some alt-historical scenarios that we would consider likely or interesting, or at least anticipate them in some way. With all of that in mind, let's take a look at a couple of event chains we've created for Prussia. For those of you who've been following our monthly updates, you may have noticed that event content for Prussia has been taking quite a while, and there's a reason for that. Prussian history of the 19th century is pretty complex in certain ways, so we deliberately chose to tackle it as a bit of a limited case when building out our editor to ensure that we could handle it. The Second Schleswig War, and the way it led to the Austro-Prussian War, is a case in point. So a quick history lesson. The whole Schleswig-Holstein question became a pressing issue because Denmark's inherited claim to the region was going to run out. The First Schleswig War didn't really resolve the problem because the UK and Russia threatened Prussia with war if they didn't back down. The UK then mediated a treaty that let Denmark keep Schleswig-Holstein, but forbade them from incorporating it into their country, essentially kicking the can down the road. About 15 years later, the Danish king dies, and the new king signs a constitution that attempts to incorporate Schleswig into Denmark. Prussia argues this violates the treaty and threatens war. This time though, the European great powers are less unified in trying to stop Prussia, especially since relations between Britain, France, and Russia are frayed because of the Crimean War. What's more, Prussia also manages to convince Austria to ally with them because Austria doesn't want Prussia to determine the fate of Schleswig-Holstein on its own. Prussia agrees to give Austria Holstein, and it'll take Schleswig. The war is won by the Austro-Prussian alliance, and the duchies are separated and given to Austria and Prussia. This arrangement inevitably leads to tensions between the two countries, and both sides begin preparations for war, forming alliances, mobilizing troops, getting agreements of non-intervention, etc. Finally, one of Austria's decisions regarding Holstein allows Prussia to accuse Austria of violating their agreement, and war breaks out. So, how do we model all that in the game? To start with, we need to check that some things are still true. Does Denmark still own Schleswig-Holstein? And is Denmark still a monarchy? If that's the case, all's well and good. If Denmark isn't still a monarchy, That technically means the whole succession issue would have been brought to a head when the governmental structure changed, so we have a slightly different event that fires if that happens. In either case, Denmark gets an event that presents it with a choice: either sign a constitution that integrates Schleswig into Denmark, or don't. If they don't, that'll lead to some pretty dire consequences in Danish politics, but at least Prussia won't have its casus belli. More on that later. If they do sign the November Constitution, Prussia gets an event letting it know what has happened in Denmark, and giving it the option to respond on the diplomatic stage. It can choose to ignore the situation, which will have various effects, not least causing some unrest in its pro-nationalist pops, or it can make clear that it's preparing for war, giving it a boost to that side of things. If it chooses the latter, Prussia will get another event about pursuing an alliance with Austria in exchange for giving them Holstein. This comes double-barreled with the threat of the rise of liberalism in the German states if they refuse. Austria then gets an event informing them of Prussia's offer, and they can choose to accept or refuse. The UK and Russia will also get events letting them know that Prussia is saber-rattling again. They can choose to ally defensively with Denmark or do nothing. Prussia and Denmark will be informed of their decisions. With all of that done, Prussia will get an event giving it a casus belli to go to war with Denmark. Obviously, the player can choose to not go to war with Denmark at all, even at this point, or if it eventually wins the war, it can choose to renege on its deal with Austria and not give it Holstein. All of this architecture exists to give the player the option to intervene or depart from the historical pathway, regardless of which country they're playing. If the AI is playing any of these countries, the choices are assigned a weighting value to determine the probability that it'll pick one choice over the other. For historical decisions, we want the AI to generally follow the historical course, even if we give the player more freedom, so we tend to give those choices a pretty high weighting. The event structure also provides the opportunity to model the various consequences for politics and diplomacy that would reasonably result from such decisions. For instance, certain political opinions may become more or less attractive as a result of the displays of apparent weakness. Certain pops may become angry at seeing their nationalist dreams thwarted, and the country's international standing may rise or fall depending on whether they project power or acquiescence. In this respect, our events are as much about modeling the consequences of not following the historical path as they are about ensuring that the historical path exists in order to create realistic circumstances for why the historical path was chosen in the first place. But what happens if the player decides to go down one of those ahistorical paths? Or what if Prussia straight up loses the war against Denmark? Well, the main consequence for Prussia is that it's a bit further away from German unification. If it wants to enact that decision, it'll need to get a hold of those provinces eventually. However, the broader consequences for Prussia's standing within the German Confederation, and particularly its relationship with Austria, still need to be modeled. Even if Prussia didn't go to war with Austria over Schleswig-Holstein, it's reasonable to assume that they'd have gone to war over something else. For that reason, we have here a couple of contingency events that have the potential to fire if Prussia and Austria aren't in the precise historical position they need to be for the Austro-Prussian War to occur. First, we check to see if Austria has taken any provinces from Prussia, or vice versa. If so, we use that contested province as an inciting incident. If not, we take another possible bone of contention between the two powers, Silesia, and present Austria with the opportunity to reclaim the provinces it lost over a century before. Prussia also has the opportunity at this point to make the various international deals it made to get alliances or keep other powers uninvolved. Since there's so much potential for the rest of Europe to have gone off course, we've chosen not to prescribe those as the specific deals with France and Italy that Prussia actually made. Instead, they just get a nice little boost of diplomatic influence points with the intimation that now might be a good time to spend some of them. Of course, the player can still choose to back down and avoid conflict, but if they're Prussia and they're trying to unify Germany, it's going to be difficult without dealing with Austria at some point. The decision for unifying Germany requires that you've dealt with both Austria and France, or that they're no longer great powers. The reason being that both countries would otherwise be likely to block any attempt at German unification by Prussia. If the player has been following the historical path, though, an event relating to tensions within Schleswig-Holstein will fire, and Prussia will have the opportunity to turn the situation to its advantage. That's probably a good note to end this dev diary on. We hope you've enjoyed it, and as always, if you have any questions or comments, let us know below. Lastly, remember to subscribe to our YouTube channel, and if you have not done so already, add Gilded Destiny to your Steam wishlist. Until our paths converge once more, we bid thee farewell. May your destiny be a gilded one.